period of time after the Civil War in the United States is a period known as Reconstruction. And basically, this is going to take up the 11 years following the Civil War ending in 1865. So we're going from 1865 really to about 1876 when we talk about the period of Reconstruction. And it's just what it sounds like. It is really just kind of trying to figure out how do we get the country back together after this horrible mess of the Civil War. You've got a couple of different things that have happened. You've got obviously some states that have been rebelling in an active armed conflict with the United States over that particular period of time. You also have a newly freed class of citizen, these former slaves, who are having to readjust or adjust to a new life or a new status quo, if you will, for what's going to happen with them as they go into the future. Now the interesting thing here is really there are basically three plans of Reconstruction that are going to be proposed, and by the end of it, this turns out to be a pretty controversial period of our history, because you could argue that as the three plans go on, it just kind of gets worse and worse for those former slaves in the South. So let's take a look real briefly at these three plans. The first one was a plan of Abraham Lincoln. Now we're a bit at a loss here because obviously Lincoln is assassinated right at the end of the Civil War. So we don't know what Abraham Lincoln would have done. We get hints from speeches he gave, from actions he took, conversations he had with folks of what he kind of saw as his vision for Reconstruction. But again, his death means we don't really get to know what he would have done with this period of time. In 1863, as Gettysburg happens and Vicksburg, and the momentum of the war starts to move towards Union victory, Lincoln starts to consider what the country is going to look like after the Civil War is over with. And so you start to see things that are happening that give us an idea of what he is going to be doing. He issues a proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, and you really get the sense from the tone of these things that he will say that it is very much about forgiveness and about wanting to bring people in and start to heal some of these divides. That not only Civil War divides, but divides have been going on concerning the issue of slavery since the country was founded. I got a little quote here where I kind of put in three things all together. Lincoln never believed that the rebelling states had left the Union. He always referred to them as the rebelling states. Never acknowledged the Confederacy, never acknowledged Jefferson Davis as the president of anything. He believed once you were a state, you couldn't not be a state anymore. And so there was nothing for him that you had to do to rejoin the Union necessarily. He was willing to extend a pardon to any non-officer of the Confederate Army. So if you were just an infantryman in the Confederacy, then you were given or he was going to extend a pardon to those folks for what they had done. There's going to be a process, obviously, that the officials ended up having to go through. Really, the scapegoat of the whole thing will end up being Jefferson Davis. KET several years ago did a neat little series on Jefferson Davis. If you're interested in kind of seeing the guy that's going to get all the blame for the Civil War, and what he wanted to do for states to kind of gain the right to participate in the government again, he wanted 10% of the voting citizens of the state to sign loyalty oaths to the United States, take an oath of loyalty and sign that. It's just 10%, so you're not talking a massive amount. He created the Freedmen's Bureau, and the Freedmen's Bureau was a government organization that was going to take land that Union forces had seized during uh, during the Civil War and actually give it to um, these former slaves, just to kind of give them a stake, give them a start at being able to build a life. That program will go away in the next administration, but it's there at least in the beginning of kind of Lincoln's thought process as far as what he's going to do about that particular that particular group of folks. Now we get to Andrew Johnson's idea of Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson was the Vice President of the United States. He'd been a senator from the state of Tennessee. Now, you may be thinking Tennessee's a state that joined the Confederacy. Andrew Johnson is the only senator from a Confederate state or a state that seceded to stay loyal to the Union. And so when Lincoln's running for president the second time, he doesn't run with Hannibal Hamlin as he did the first time. He picks Andrew Johnson to be his vice president. Again, kind of that theme of reconciliation, of wanting to be able to reach out maybe to people in the South who were still on the fence about what was going on with the Confederacy, just to almost say, hey, we can put this back together again. What he of course doesn't imagine is that Andrew Johnson will wind up as president of the United States. When Lincoln's assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, there's also an attempt made on Andrew Johnson's life. There were several government officials that were supposed to be there. So the plan was they were going to take out the Secretary of War, the Secretary of State, President, Vice President, some other folks, just to kind of cripple the government. They were hoping that would make the South rise up again. The guy that was supposed to assassinate Andrew Johnson, though, couldn't find the courage. He took the assignment, ended up drinking most of the night away, and never trying to carry out the attack on Andrew Johnson. So when Lincoln's assassinated, Johnson becomes president, and so we enter a period called presidential Reconstruction. So really, for those first couple of years, he was closer to the Lincoln plan than what will originally happen. He was going to extend the rights of citizenship back to Confederate soldiers. Still wanted those officers to have a couple of extra hoops to jump through, but regular soldiers were going to be given those rights of citizenship back again. He wanted universal suffrage for all men, so he was going to extend voting rights to African American males. Now that eventually will be done with the 15th Amendment in 1870, but he was going to do it even before then. And he wanted to make it a condition of rejoining the Union, or for those states to get back in the good graces of the United States, for them to ratify the 14th Amendment, which extended the rights of citizenship to former slaves. So as he starts to build this up, there's resistance in the South, obviously, to having these changes made. One of the big things that you see is something called black codes that end up coming out of this particular stretch. Black codes really focus on labor. A lot of folks in the South were worried about, well, what's going to happen to our labor force? How are we going to keep this way of life going? And so they tried to make laws to force former slaves to sign work contracts for a year that they were going to come and labor, and they put fines or punishments on if you didn't have one of those things signed. So it was kind of trying to force people to work. Really, what you see is they try and keep these folks as close to the condition of slavery as they can possibly keep them. Andrew Johnson doesn't get a chance to kind of fulfill his promise when black codes start to take away some of these rights for people in the South. There's a backlash, and there's a group of Republicans in Congress who in 1866 say, well, you know what, you're going to get out of the way, we're going to lead. It was a small group, it was a minority group called, that is known in history as the Radical Republicans. And the Radical Republicans, they'll come in and convince a lot of the moderate Republicans in the Senate and the House to go along with them. And so they were much more punitive in the measures they wanted to take against the former Confederate states. They are going to divide the South into 5 military districts. Let me show you real quick what those look like. In each of those 5 military districts was governed by an officer there whose job it was to oversee the rewriting of the state constitution, the this signing or taking of loyalty oaths, things like that. And so for these states don't have control of themselves. This is the federal government. This is the military controlling these states until they jump through these hoops to get back in the good graces. And so you can see those 5 military districts. Tennessee is not included, which makes sense because Tennessee was obviously Andrew Johnson's home state. But those are the states, and then you see the dates on the map are the dates they come back or given readmission. The first one's Arkansas. Alabama and the Carolinas follow pretty quickly after that. But it takes a couple of years, right, for these folks to come in. They are going to pass the Reconstruction Act of 1867. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 has a distinction in American history. It is the first override of a presidential veto in American history. So Johnson tried to veto the act that was going to split the South up into these military districts, and Congress had enough votes to override that veto and put it in. These Reconstruction Acts also wanted to make sure that the right to vote was extended to black men, that it was protected, and that they were allowed to hold office. And you actually see the first federal representatives of color come in this period of time. Hiram Revels from the state of Mississippi is the first black senator, and Joseph Rainey from South Carolina is the first black representative into Congress. So that actually happens in the 1860s, that those guys are going to be sent. This is not counting for the number of statewide offices that'll be filled by African Americans too. So you start to see some inroads made in the government. Well, what that's going to do is it's going to make obviously people in the South very nervous, and there's going to be blowback to what they were trying to do. The radical Republicans will impeach Andrew Johnson. He didn't agree with their ideas of Reconstruction, and so they basically find a way to impeach him. He wanted to replace, I think it was Edward Stanton, his Secretary of War, on his cabinet, and to keep him from doing this, they passed the Tenure of Office Act, which basically said that if the Senate approved somebody for an office, the president couldn't just fire them. He had to get congressional approval, and so to test that, he fired him. And for violating that law, Andrew Johnson becomes our first president to be impeached. He survives the impeachment process by 1 vote, which of course isn't a whole lot, but that's why he ends up getting impeached. And really, for the rest of his term, he doesn't exercise a ton of power there. He'll be a 1-term president, and then eventually he's replaced by Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of the Union for the Civil War. The Reconstruction ends in 1876, but we start to see the idea that this is going to end even quicker than that. 1968-69, Pulaski, Tennessee, we see the formation of a group called the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan obviously is something that is around today. They'll be much more powerful in kind of a different form in the 1920s, and so we'll see them again there. But it starts out as a club for Confederate War veterans. General Nathan Bedford Forrest of Forrest Gump fame is the first kind of big leader of this club. And basically what it does is it's a terrorist organization. They use violence and intimidation to try to discourage black voters from voting. So they'll target those folks, killing some, beating others, intimidating others. They also targeted white Republicans from the South. There are 2 terms that you hear there, 2 great terms. Carpetbaggers is one that you hear, and scallywags were used to refer to Republican Southerners because they were looked at as being kind of traitors to the region by a lot of these folks. And so the Klan really gets powerful, and there are other groups, but the Klan's the biggest that will do this. Uh, Powerful enough by 1870 that the government will pass what's called the Enforcement Act. It's known in history as the Ku Klux Klan Act, um, and it targeted these folks who were doing these acts of terrorism to arrest them, to stop them from doing that. It ensured voting rights for for the folks who were going to protect people who wanted to vote, and it allowed the federal government to send in troops to protect those rights in the South. And so, really quickly, the power of the Klan is broken. Like I said, won't show back up really until the 1920s. It all comes to a crashing halt, though, in 1876. 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes is running against Samuel Tilden for President of the United States. And basically, in what's known as the Compromise of 1876, to win the presidency, Rutherford B. Hayes makes a deal. And he says, okay, if you guys will give me your support for the presidency, then I will remove federal troops. We'll end basically Reconstruction if you'll do that. And so with the removal of those troops, the governments of the South will flip back over to Democratic control. You will see a lot more restrictions, and we'll talk about those when we talk about Jim Crow laws in the later talk. You see a lot more restrictions being put on the rights of African Americans at that time, and really until we get to the 1950s and start to see the modern civil rights movement, they are much closer to the condition of slavery in a segregated society than ever would have been the intent of Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, or the radical Republicans. Because they cede control, the South kind of takes back over and says, okay, well, they won't be slaves anymore, but we're gonna make sure they're a second class of citizen. And a lot of that stems from, like I said, this decision that's made. This 1876, the election went to the House of Representatives. One of the only times that's happened. And so to get the votes, basically Rutherford B. Hayes messes over those folks. Got a couple of great videos here on the playlist. Encourage you to take a look at dealing with these topics as well if you want to dig a little more into them. And I will see you back for Plessy versus Ferguson.